Can't refuse me, right?
My daughter likes to make the joke because this is how bad it is. My daughter's 14, and at that.
Folks, welcome inside the Parisi Palace, high above 2919 East Broadway. This is a special edition of the Jake Feinberg Show, coming to you live on Power Talk. Please go to our website, powertalk.live. Download all of our free live local shows, including Solomon on Blast and the Jim Parisi Show and the Jake Feinberg Show. We are full on extraterrestrial radio, and we thank you for making us part of your day today. And a couple weeks ago, I had an opportunity to interview pop rock icon Huey Lewis, and he mentioned that when he did the Chicago musical on Broadway, he worked with a wonderful Broadway contractor who knew Stan Getz since they were in their teens or even younger in the East Bronx, and just piqued my interest. He told me to go and scout this cat out, and it took me a minute, but finally connected with him, and it is such a high honor. Seymour Red Press, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Welcome to you, Jake, as well.
Mazel tov. How are you, sir?
I'm good. I'm really good. I'm 92, and I'm still involved on Broadway. I quit playing when I was 90, and but I contract Broadway shows and whatever else comes in.
That's unbelievable. I mean, I love the longevity and the lineage, but I want to go back to this idea. Can you talk about just the vibe and growing up in the outside the boroughs of New York City? I don't know if you grew up in the East Bronx, but can you paint the picture of how important music was to you guys, and just in general, just the hard scrabble life that you guys had growing up?
Okay. I'll talk about myself a little bit, even though this is about Stan.
Please go ahead.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So both of us started playing the saxophone very young. I started playing because my father said to me, "You want to play the saxophone." He was a frustrated musician and a salesman, but he had a set of drums in front of the radio, and when the swing bands were on, he'd play with the swing bands. He taught himself to play piano, but he never got there. And Stan, as well, must have started playing at least at 13, if not earlier than that. He was born in Philadelphia, as you know.
Right.
And his father had a print shop. He printed stuff. In fact, my first business card was printed by Stan Getz's father. And I still have a copy of it right now, and it was Seymour Red Press, and the red was in red.
That is classic. His dad struggled to stay employed, but he did do that for you. That's good.
The best teacher in New York, in the Bronx, was Bill Shiner. And all the aspiring players went to him for lessons. I started with Bill, I think, I started playing in probably 1938, something like that. And Stan was already studying with him. And, of course, Stan was the most talented of all of us, and we knew that. Even at that age, he had perfect pitch, so you would play something and he would play it right back to you. And I was an alto saxophone player. He was a tenor saxophone player. At that point in my life, I thought you either played one or the other. But at one point, Stan picked up an alto, and he sounded wonderful, of course, on the alto as well. We played in pickup bands. At that time, ballrooms were all over the city because it was in the swing era, and the dance, the Lindy Hop, was the rage. And there would be pickup leaders put together bands, and he and I played in a couple of them where there would be 4 or 5 saxes, 3 trumpets, big bands. And we played stocks, the stock arrangements of the day, which were the copies of what the big bands were playing at that point. Um, Also, Bill Shiner put together a band of just saxophones, clarinets, and a rhythm section. And different people sent orchestrations for that, and Stan and I were in that band as well. Um, let's see, where do I go?
No, I got a lot in my head. Can you talk about this idea of you talk about perfect pitch? At that point in time, were you guys was Shiner allowing you to play a lot of improvisation because Stan had this just his his flowing melodics, the way he improvised. Johnny Mandel's, I mean, Lalo Schifrin and cats I've talked to. I mean, you could write songs to his melodies.
That's true.
Was he
That's
already
true.
in that groove at that point, or was that something maybe he developed with Teagard?
Okay. The Bill Shiner band that I remember, the saxophone band, the woodwind band, was not an improvisation. However, there was improvisation on the club dates we would play because these were the arrangements of the big bands, and where the big band recordings had a saxophone solo for Vito Musso or whoever, Stan had to play that. Well, that is interesting that you bring that up because at that point he was playing like if I said to you Tex Beneke,
Mm-hmm.
would you understand that style?
Absolutely.
Okay.
But,
But
maybe for the lay audience listening all over the world, just kind of break down what that is.
well, it's a very commercial, very what can I call it? I can't call it corny. I wouldn't call it corny, but I never did like the Glenn Miller band.
It's like a champagne.
I was a
champagne
Benny
style?
Goodman
Yeah, Benny Goodman, right?
specialist. That's to me that was the band and the tenor solos there. But even the tenor solos there, they were good, but they were more black. Okay,
Got it.
more black. Whereas Tex Beneke was a white kind of. Does that mean anything to you?
Dude, listen, man. I'm 38 years old, but I got to tell you, man, you're grooving. Keep going. I love it. I love it.
I happen to have recordings of Lester Young with Count Basie and Lester Young accompanying Billie Holiday. And I don't know that Stan ever heard those. And I fell in love with Lester Young, which is the cool sound, which is what they all played, at that during Stan's period. And I brought him home to me, to my home, and I played Lester Young for him. Now, that may not have made an immediate change in the way he played, but it set it up for when it started to become popular. He was aware. And I always feel that I introduced him to the cool sound. That may be wrong, but I have that feeling because he had never listened to Lester Young until I brought him home.
Let me ask you a question. This is important. So you were hip to Lester before that sound got popular. Is that right?
Yes. Oh yeah.
And so
yes.
And
because he was the popular sound then was Coleman Hawkins.
Right.
You know that name?
Sure. So
okay.
That was the other school,
Yeah. The popular and the sections where Coleman and Lester were the two tenors in the band, Coleman got most of the solos, and occasionally Lester would get a solo to play. But it was a completely different sound, a completely different approach to jazz, and I fell in love with it. So let me. That's one little story to tell you. When Shiner had this band we put together, he tried to get us into one of the hotels, as put us in there on a gig, and we auditioned for a woman named Adela Kramer, who owned the Edison Hotel and the Lincoln Hotel in New York City, and Shiner fronted the band and played for her, and this I'll never forget. And when we finished playing, she said to him, "You know, that guy should be the leader, not you." And she pointed to Stan. Right? Not because of his playing, because he was so handsome. He was a very good-looking young boy, but he was only 14, 15 at that point. Um, of course, nothing happened, and we didn't get the gig. We didn't. At about in 1943, the war started 41. 43, I turned 18. Stan turned 15. I was drafted into the Army. Stan, I guess you know this, went with Jack Teagarden's band when he was 15. You know
Absolutely.
that. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Were you drafted? You said you were drafted?
I was drafted.
You were drafted. Okay, so he got in ninth grade with Teagarden, and then the truant officer came and tracked him down, and Teagarden signed off as his guardian.
Right, right.
So go ahead.
I went into the Army, and I spent 3 years. Actually, I went in with a band. I mean, that's a political thing on my side. Somehow it was arranged. I didn't, but I was involved in it. And I lost contact with Stan. In 1945, I came home on leave, and it just happened that Stan was in town, and at that point he was playing with Benny Goodman. And he took me out. They were in New Jersey, and bought me dinner and a drink. And I heard the band that night. And of course, as you know, Benny Goodman was my favorite. And he now, at such an early life, was already at the top of the big band era players. And I remember there was a tenor solo he played that became famous with Benny Goodman. I don't remember what the name of it was now.
Really? Because that's really interesting because he really got on the map. The only one that I know that put him on the map was Early Autumn with Woody Herman.
No, it was before that even. There was a solo he played with Benny Goodman.
Solo with Benny. I would
that,
really
that
be
made a little noise.
Wow, I'd
right?
love to know
It
that.
wasn't
too.
Early Autumn, but
Yeah,
as much as Early Autumn.
Interesting.
It made a little noise. I got out of the Army in '46, and all I ever wanted to be was a musician. And I've been very lucky, Jake, that I was able to spend my life doing what I love. And I started to go out on the road with bands. And the next time I saw Stan was about 1949, maybe 50, somewhere in there. I was in a band called Tony Pastor.
Oh, sure,
and
sure.
We were in Chicago, and he was playing in a nightclub. And in the hotel with me, who was, truthfully, he probably was working someplace, was a tenor saxophone by the name of Bud Freeman. You know that name?
I sure do.
Bud Freeman, of course, in the 30s, 40s, was one of the premier sax tenor players in the jazz field. And we decided, he and I met him there to go to hear Stan play. We went to the club. I didn't know where Stan was staying or anything, so it was a surprise. We went in, the two of us sat there, and Stan played. And Bud kept saying to me, "He's remarkable. It flows. It just flows." He said to me, "It flows out of his thing like it flows out of Benny Goodman's clarinet." He was amazed, right? And when Stan finished the set and went on break, I went back to see him. And the first thing he said to me is, "Get rid of that motherfucker. I can tell he hates the way I play." And that was Stan Getz at that point.
Okay, let's just stop right there. Okay, so he was wildly off base about how Bud felt about him, but
can't be more off base.
So
can't be more off base. And so I defended Bud.
Right.
Told him he was wrong. After the gig, Bud went home, and I stayed with Stan. He had already been in trouble. I don't know what year that was. What was the year that he... ended up in jail.
Well, that was in the mid '50s in Seattle. That was like '54 when that major.
Something had happened. Well, I knew that he was into drugs.
Yeah, sure.
Something, I knew it. And as an old friend, I tried to talk him out of it, you know. And I said, why, Stan, why? And he says to me, this is even more off base. This is more off base than he felt about Bud Freeman. He said, Red, if I could play like you, I would be better. Now, let me tell you, first of all, I'm not a jazz player. Second of all, I was a lead alto player. That in those days, you didn't have to play jazz. You just had to have a nice sound and a good feel. My talent, in a million years, I can't do what Stan Getz could do, right? That's such bullshit. And also, not only bullshit, it's like catering to me in some way, you know.
Right.
Wait a minute, my wife wants to say something.
Yeah.
Wow.
At that point, you said, I've gone off that.
Oh, and when I spoke to him about being on drugs, he said, I'm not doing that anymore. I quit. I'm straight.
Yeah.
We went back to his hotel room, and on top of the bureau was a needle. So he was lying. He was far, far from sensitive. It was a disaster as far as I was concerned. A disaster.
Talking to Seymour Red Press here on the Jake Feinberg Show live on Power Talk. Red, can you, I mean, I've talked to Helen Merrill. I've talked to, I've gone as far back. You're the farthest back I've been able to go. But a lot of people say that Stan just never, he was mentally developed as a teenager. He never grew mentally.
That's probably true.
When you talk about these behaviors, can you relate it to anything from his ethnic heritage or just his upbringing as to was he, because he was never fully diagnosed as a bipolar depressive, even though his son is pretty convinced that he was. Obviously, he had major drug addictions. But where do you feel this pain and this insecurity, where did it derive from, in your opinion?
I've thought about it over the years, and the only thing that I can think of, and it's a minor theory, I'm not good at things, is that he went on the road too young. He went on the road at 15 years old with people much, much older than him, with a sense of insecurity that he never got rid of. And when you think of a 15-year-old, I think of my son and my grandkid. 15, you know nothing.
Nothing.
And to be set on his own, out on the road, with a bunch of people who drink. At that point, alcohol was, everybody drank, including me. And it's very difficult. So I can't talk about bipolar because I never noticed that in him. I just noticed another really talented guy, didn't talk too much, wasn't philosophical, but was a great player. Was just great. And of course, as a musician, when you hear somebody play great, you idolize them, whether they're stupid, whatever they are. Right.
Well, I think you're 100% right. Now, he definitely, listen, he did not, we know he didn't graduate high school. He didn't take the traditional academic ladder, but he had this gift. And it was very evident. Can you talk about his ability, like the night you saw him with Benny in Jersey, just his ability to bring people into him, to get them to feel what he was playing and that magic, because anybody that I talked to, Woody would point to him for the first solo, Benny would point to him for the first solo. He had that ability. You are a Broadway, you've been a prolific person on Broadway. You know the magic of how people can bring an audience into their life. Can you talk about the way Stan used to do that effortlessly?
That's hard to do. He just had a melodic sense. He had a wonderful melodic sense. And no matter what style he was playing, the melody came out. And that's what people hear. People hear the melody. And it I mean, I still listen to I have his CDs here. I still put them on and still listen and still wonder at how he thought of those things. And he was usually probably out of his mind most of those times that he made those CDs. But it's a melodic sense that some people have and some people don't. Benny Goodman had it. Benny Goodman was not a great interpreter of jazz and into the future and changing styles. He just had a way. Charlie Shavers used to say about Benny Goodman can play ba-da-da-da-da-da, and everybody will go, yeah. You know, it's just a thing that some musicians have, that very few. And that's my best explanation for that.
No, absolutely.
Let me add something that I didn't
ahead.
add at the beginning.
Yeah, go ahead.
When we studied with Bill Shiner, also studying with him, and I don't know this, was Alan
Greenspan.
what's his name?
Greenspan.
Alan Greenspan, who became the chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was one of the students there. He didn't play in the band with us, in his band, because he wasn't one of the best. But he was there.
Did Stan feel? I mean,
let me see.
How well?
Let me see
how
what
well
else I can tell you.
No, it's okay.
The last time
Yeah, go ahead.
I actually had contact with Stan, he was playing in a club down in the village, and my wife and I went to see him. And of course, he sounded marvelous. But he played most of the night with his back to the audience. Now, what do you make of that? I don't know what to make of that.
Do you have any idea what year this was?
My wife guesses it was about 58, 59, somewhere in there.
Maybe 60.
Maybe 60, she says.
And you're telling me that at that point that was the defining move of a guy, Miles Davis, used to turn his back on the audience. You're telling me Stan was turning his back on the audience.
Yeah. He was in his own world. So, principally, I've given you, what's that? Oh, yeah, I spoke to him. I didn't say don't turn your back on the audience, but, he sat with us that evening at our table, right? I think he respected me. I was 3 years older than him at the time, a little more mature, and I already had political feelings about the world. I was a different kind of person than him. Stan was music. That was it. Beginning, end, music.
Can you talk?
Many years later,
yeah, go ahead.
I lost contact with him at that point. At one point, he was living in Westchester, I think. I was thinking of having a reunion with all of the Bill Shiner students, but I never put it together. And I don't know if he would have come if I asked him. But many, many years later, when he was dying, I got a call from a mutual friend saying, Stan sent regards to you. And I felt bad about that and said, give me his phone number, which I didn't have, and I'll call him. And time went by, and I finally decided to call him, and I got a call that day that he died. Yeah.
A couple of things. When you say that you were, you had political feelings and you were an advocate and and Stan was music, a lot, even though he didn't have an academic pedigree, but he was extremely well read. Most people say he was an incredibly bright cat. You're telling me that
yes.
Can you talk about any other discussions you had with him?
No, very difficult. I'm sorry.
Okay. What about it?
Our life, his and my life were music.
What about
it was music?
What can you talk to me? What did he share with you about his parents? I mean, this is the difference. This is the thing, because he was on the road. He was on the road at 15, and we talked about that being part of his downfall. But part of the reason he was on the road was because his dad couldn't keep a job, and there was a lot of
his father had problems. Yeah.
Can you talk about the pressure that might have been there to have to go and be in this, with a bunch of older guys who had a lot of bad habits, but ultimately, can you talk about Stan's relationship with his dad and mom?
No, I don't. I can't.
Did you ever go to his
No, I don't remember if I ever went to his house. I went to his father's shop, but I don't remember ever going to his house. I knew very little about his upbringing, and we never, we were too young to talk like that. Truthfully,
Right, but being that you were a musician on the road, can you part of what I'm trying to get at is that Stan fell in, with guys at a period of time in music when jazz was at its height, but you had, Bird, and you had all these cats coming out, and I just wanted to get your take on the idea that a lot of guys were using junk, and the idea was that if you were not using junk, then you were not trusted. That in fact you were outside of the club. And
that may be true. I was lucky in that I didn't play with Buddy Rich, and I didn't play with Woody Herman. I played with Tommy Dorsey, and we were we turned on a little marijuana, had a little drink, but nobody in that band that I remember was into deeper than that. Later, I played with Benny Goodman, and by that time, the era had changed. I think the only one on drugs in that would have been, tenor player. Name the cool tenor players.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to think, but black or white?
White.
Oh, maybe like
up in Stan's class.
Wow.
Zoot Sims.
Oh, Zoot. Yeah, well, no, the four brothers. I mean, Al, Zoot.
Yeah. So he was with Benny when I was with Benny, and he may have been the only one on that band that was into junk. No one else was. So I wasn't involved with a clique of people, and Zoot was not friendly with me because I wasn't in that club,
How did you evolve, Red, personally as a musician over time? I mean, you said to get in originally, you just had to have a nice sound, good time feel. How did you? I mean, you just stopped playing 2 years ago. How did you grow as a musician over time?
I think I grew.
Yeah, no, I think you.
All right, I studied with Bill, who was a good teacher. I had some talent. When I went into the Army, actually, there was a note on Bill's board. Do you want to join an Army band? So I wasn't the only one from Bill Shiner who went into the Army. A few of the students, I don't know if you know the name Lenny Hambro, but a few of the students went in, and it was a good swing band, and again with older people that had more experience than I did. And in the 3 years in the Army, I went from a sort of amateur to a professional, and that's all I wanted to do. I got out of the Army, and I got out in February, and I think in May I joined a band called Bobby Sherwood, because a couple of the guys in the band were in the Army with me. So I now became in the big band field, and I went from band to band and sort of hopefully getting better as I went, hearing people around me play, which is always very important to a musician, to hear things better than yourself and realize what you can do. And so from the time I got out of the Army in 46 until 57, in 57 I played with Benny Goodman's band, and And I was with Tommy for a couple of years. Actually, we did a show called Stage Show in New York here, 52 Saturday nights in a row. We were on television, I think called Stage Show, which was sponsored by comic. Oh, God. I keep forgetting names. Yeah, Jackie Gleason sponsored it.
Sure.
So I went from band to band and hopefully improving my playing. But I got to the Benny Goodman in '57, it was dying. The whole thing was dying. The only one really towards the end was not even Benny, was Tommy Dorsey was the only one that had a band that was successful to the end, and then he died, of course.
Right. Well, part of it was that
he died, I think, 3 weeks after I left the band.
Part of it was that at the tail end of the 40s, they put a surtax on the ballrooms to support the World War II. Ballparks, stadiums, ballrooms where the big bands thrived, and the ballrooms couldn't handle the additional cost. So those ballrooms turned into smaller clubs, and then all of a sudden the big bands went to quintets and quartets. And is that what you mean by dying? The big bands were dying.
No, the big bands died for a different reason. The big band died because of rock music.
Right.
And a different trend in music, which stopped the ballrooms from being busy because the Lindy Hop stopped, people stopped going. No, swing died.
But when you
it's
say
not that
when you say
ballrooms were taxed, I don't agree with that.
Well, that's just something.
I remember the first time I did a club date here in New York with a semi-famous black conductor who was using a pick. You know, at that point there were pickup bands a lot because big bands couldn't 52 weeks a year couldn't stay in business. They would get a 10-week run, and then they would give up the band, and a new band would be 6 months later. They put a new band together again. It was dying out, and as I say at the beginning, I got a call from this black conductor. We did a date, and I realized when I went there that nobody was doing the Lindy Hop, and we weren't playing swing. We were playing different music. The world changed. The Beatles changed it. Elvis Presley changed it. When we did that stage show with Tommy Dorsey, Elvis was one of our guests on that show. And I didn't even know the name. But when it was explained to me that this guy is selling out baseball stadiums all over the United States, the world changed. Our role in it changed. We were stars. I used to give autographs, and it changed, you know. And that I don't agree. Taxes did not stop that from happening.
No. I want to finish my point. The point was that so a lot of the ballrooms changed. Smaller clubs became more prevalent during bebop, and therefore a lot of people said modern jazz at that time wasn't danceable. But it was, this is not. We don't need to debate this. You lived through it. You mentioned before Getz had the Tex Beneke sound when you first met him. Can you talk about how he honed his sound over time, especially during his time with? How do you think his time with Teagarden affected his sound?
Affected his playing?
Exactly.
Is that the question?
Yes.
It's hard for me to say. All I can say is that by the time I saw him, which was 2 years later, he was playing a cool sound. 2 years. I don't believe he got that in Teagarden's band. Teagarden was a Dixieland player. And I'm sure Stan fit in to what he heard in the Dixieland group. But between that time and the time I heard him with Benny Goodman, he had changed his style. You know, I was thinking of one other thing. When I came out to see him with Benny, I was outside. I was in the rehearsal not a rehearsal, a suite or something where they were staying, and he was in another room warming up. And I realized he particularly played warm-ups that Bill Shiner had given us to play in a tremendously fast pace. He was sort of showing off for me, right? I love him. I mean, he was a great musician. He was a great musician.
Was he a great person?
No. He was a neutral person.
What does that mean?
Well, as I say, he was not a communicator. Other people you could get very close to. There were other students there that I became very close to. He was hard to get close to, but his age was different. It was hard. Most of the people that I became closer with were my age, 18, 17, 19, in that area. He was a kid, you know.
Right. I mean, he was just, maturity-wise was younger than you, but yet he had this, it was God-given, what he had.
That's right.
That's right?
It's there. Just having perfect pitch. Perfect pitch doesn't make you a great musician. It gives you a certain advantage. Play melodically, to improvise where you're taken in. That's a different talent. You can have that without perfect pitch, but he had it all.
What was the last gig you played, Red?
Well, the last gig I played is 2 years ago. I was playing in Chicago. That was my show. I contracted it. I contracted myself, but that was 20 years before. Well, then it was 18. It's now 20. That was 18 years before. I moved in 1957, except for an occasional thing I did with Benny. Paul Whiteman at that point was at the end. I did some stuff with him, but mostly 9/10 was Broadway. And I became a contractor, and that's a different story. That's when you do a series on me, I'll tell you about that.
Well, we are going to do a series on you. You don't even know that. You don't even know that.
But I started as a player on Broadway, and for the first time in my life, I was sitting down in New York working 52 weeks a year when I had a hit show, and I went from show to show, and I became popular with the contractors because I play well. I'm not Stan Getz, but I play. What I have to do and what you need on Broadway, I do very well. And I moved into the contracting field. Once I moved into that, then it's different than just playing in a show. At times I've had 4 or 5 shows at the same time running on Broadway. In fact, last year I had 4 shows on Broadway and a show on the road. I had 5 shows going. So I played from show to show, and if it was my show, I made myself the lead alto player, of course, first clarinet, first flute. And at 90, I decided to stop for many reasons. I still feel I was playing well, but and so did everybody else. That's true. They still say to me at Chicago, nobody